It's 2021, and I feel like the world is finally ready to face the truth about Breath of the Wild. When the game came out in 2017, it was immediately hailed as a masterpiece of game design, receiving perfect scores from all corners of the gaming community, from IGN to Egoraptor and Dunkey, notoriously critical gaming YouTubers. Some were even willing to go so far as to say that Breath of the Wild was the greatest game of all time. But does the game really deserve this lofty praise? I don't think so. Since most of this video is going to be me criticizing the game, let's start with what it does right. Breath of the Wild is far from the greatest game of all time, and I'm going to explain why, trust me. But it may have the best opening ever. Seriously, the first few hours of Breath of the Wild were spellbinding in a way that I had never experienced before. I walked out of my cave with my Nintendo Switch at my side and a whole world to explore and enjoy. I was immediately taken with the scope and splendor of the landscape around me, and in that moment, I just wanted to spend every waking moment exploring every inch of the map. But I couldn't do that. I first needed to beat the Great Plateau section of the map, which cleverly serves as a tutorial stage that taught me the basics of the game. I fought some monsters, I solved some puzzles, got a taste of the weather and temperature mechanics, I figured out cooking, and I even talked to the infamous old man to get some plot exposition as well as some helpful tips. It was all there. It was all fun and well designed. And the choice to put the first section of the map on a plateau is absolutely genius. The whole time you're exploring, you're looking around at the horizon and enjoying the view. I started picking out specific landmarks and going, what's the deal with that mountain that's split in half? What's at the top of that volcano? Why is Hyrule Castle encased in a big pink fart cloud? Essentially, the game makes you ask all of the right questions from the beginning, and more importantly, it makes you genuinely excited to explore the vast lands before you. And those lands are vast. This is another thing Breath of the Wild does right. The map is absolutely massive, and it's gorgeous visually. At some points in the game, just looking around was enough to keep me totally invested. And the game's soundtrack complements the aesthetics perfectly. It's calm, relaxing, and present enough to be noticeable, but it's never distracting. Breath of the Wild is also one of the few open-world games I've played that absolutely needed to be open-world. We're in an era of gaming where big developers can just slap open world in capital letters on the back of the box and sell more copies. They can also make games open world because it makes things take longer. You can stretch 8 hours of content into a 12-hour game when the player has to spend time locating each individual mission and backtracking to places they've already been. I mean, seriously, think back on the last 5 games you've played through that have open worlds, and then think about how much time you spent driving or going from one location to the next. For this reason, whenever I play an open-world game, I ask myself one thing. Would this game be better if it just had a level select screen? And the answer is almost always yes. But in Breath of the Wild, that's not the case. The world feels like one continuous place where you can get a sense of direction for where you are due to the huge and noticeable landmarks throughout Hyrule. Death Mountain, Mount Nairu, and the Divine Beasts are all located towards the corners of the map, whereas Hyrule Castle is located centrally, so there's always one landmark in your field of view. These design choices also deliberately make the game more cohesive and recognizable. The game allows you to fast travel to any shrine or Sheikah Tower you've discovered, and this makes backtracking minimal in areas you've explored thoroughly. Additionally, the fast travel component motivates players to find shrines in unexplored areas, making them immediately valuable to the player. I had a genuine sense of giddiness whenever I ventured into the unknown. But this is where the problems begin. I always felt excitement at the beginning of an area, but that excitement was totally unfounded. As soon as I explored the entire map in Breath of the Wild, something dawned on me, a gross realization that led me to making this video in the first place. Breath of the Wild is so often praised for breaking the Zelda formula, which consisted of dungeons, items that help you beat said dungeons, and bosses. But Breath of the Wild actually has a formula all its own, and it's every bit as predictable and boring. Breath of the Wild is a game that banks so heavily on its sense of variety. The reason you want to explore a new area is because you want to find something new that you haven't seen before. Breath of the Wild does a pretty good job of tricking the player into thinking they found something new when in reality they haven't. All of Breath of the Wild's variety occurs on the surface of the game. The only thing that changes from one area to another is the way that area looks. Sure, you might be in the snow, or in a desert, or in a forest, but the area you're in is going to play out the exact same way the ones before it did. You're going to find a new area, see a camp of enemies, and that camp of enemies is going to be made up of either pigs or lizards. Can we just talk about how lazy that is for a second? They give you an enormous map to explore, and there are 2 main enemy types. I can't be the only person who is disappointed by lizards and pigs in the snow area. It's a snow area, Nintendo. You can do better than snow lizards and snow pigs. Yes, I know there's the Yiga clan and the Lynels and the Guardians and the Octoroks, but those enemies make up such a small percentage of the overall population that they're almost negligible. Simply repainting the same cast of enemies for the entire world doesn't constitute variety. In fact, it slaps variety in the face. And this leads back into my main point about Breath of the Wild's intrinsic formula. I'm sure that when I said every area plays out the same way, you thought,
"No, I remember finding all these cool things and it was so awesome and different every time."
Let me clear that up for you. What you meant to say was, I found all of these shrines. This is my huge problem with exploration in Breath of the Wild. When you come across something interesting, like a cave or a mysterious pillar on a mountain, or just a big mountain in general that you want to climb, what awaits you at the end is a shrine. Every single time. All of those questions you were asking yourself at the Great Plateau get answered all at once. What's with that mountain that looks like it's split in half? It's 2 shrines. Whoa, I wonder what's at the top of Mount Nairu. It looks so awesome. It's a shrine. Wow, look at that island off in the distance. I can't wait to get over there. Another shrine. Look at this cave I found. It's a shrine. Wonder what happens when I put this ball in this hole. Another shrine. Wow, a skull-shaped lake. You see where this is going. And you also see how this gets boring really quickly. Could you imagine what it would feel like if you found a cave and it led you to an underground stronghold of enemies with a unique mini-boss at the end? That is greatest game of all time material. But no, we just get shrines. In Egoraptor's Ocarina of Time video, he claims that waiting is the bane of exploration, and that's somewhat true. While waiting does hamper exploration as a gameplay experience, predictability is the true nemesis of exploration. And once you realize that every cool landmark in Breath of the Wild leads to yet another shrine, the game becomes exceedingly predictable. And don't even get me started on Korok seeds. Between shrines and Korok seeds, the game's entire sense of mystery disappears. Think back to how many times you found something in Breath of the Wild that didn't lead to one of those 2 things. I can count them on one hand, maybe. And in a game about exploration, that is an enormous, if not game-breaking, issue.
But wait, the shrines were so cool that they made exploring worth it.
No, they didn't, and here's why. Since shrines are clearly an integral part of Breath of the Wild's world, making them fun and interesting was crucial for its gameplay. But this is one of the many areas where I feel Breath of the Wild substitutes quantity over quality. Before DLC, there were 120 shrines in the game, and I got every single damn one, so I feel like I'm qualified to talk about their contribution to the experience. Out of those 120 shrines, about half of them are either Blessing Shrines or Test of Strength Shrines. Blessing Shrines just give you the Spirit Orb and chest without a puzzle, so you basically just walk in, grab your prize, and leave. These shrines felt like a useless formality to me during my playthrough. Why not have 2 chests outside of the shrine and then a fast travel beacon? It would save the player time and trim a lot of the loading screens that already plague the shrine system. But Blessing Shrines are not nearly as ridiculous as Test of Strength Shrines. Tests of Strength put the player up against a guardian enemy of varying difficulty, minor, moderate, or major, depending on the shrine. The main issue here is that the circumstances of the fight remain the same each time. It's the same enemy with the same weapons in the same futuristic room over and over again. I realize that expecting Nintendo to create a new enemy for each test of strength is unrealistic, but what about 3 different ones, one for each difficulty? Is that so much to ask from the greatest game ever? So not only does the player know that every cool landmark leads to a shrine, they also know that there's a 50% chance that shrine has a boring test of strength or a blessing in it, neither of which contribute positively to the game experience in any way. But that still leaves the other 60 shrines, which had unique puzzles in them. While these are undoubtedly the best shrines in the game, except for the ones with motion controls, they still aren't deserving of the praise Zelda fans give them. Be honest, if you played the game, how many times did you just get frustrated and start cycling through Sheikah abilities until something glowed? For me, that's how a large portion of the puzzle shrines played out. I also hear time and time again how Breath of the Wild's puzzles let the player solve them in their own way. If you could see me, I'm doing air quotes. Just imagine I'm doing air quotes. Anyway, Puzzles are the only time where letting the player solve them in their own way is a bad thing. Puzzles have one answer. That's what makes them puzzles. If you could fit the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together in any combination, I doubt you would be satisfied with completing it. In Breath of the Wild, so many of the puzzle shrines could be solved by cutting corners or using Sheikah abilities to subvert the challenge. But hey, at least there's awesome gear waiting at the end, right? Not exactly. If designers are going to introduce a gear system into a game, there are two necessary ingredients that make that system good. And this is sort of a tangent, but this is something that makes me so upset about game design because it's really not that hard, and so many games drop the ball on this. Firstly, there needs to be objectively powerful gear, and secondly, that powerful gear needs to be hard to get. That's it. This is one of the few things that loot shooters like Borderlands and Destiny get right. The best gear is always hard to get, and it's usually so powerful that every player will go to the ends of the earth to get it. Unfortunately, Breath of the Wild doesn't have either of those things. I bought armor at Hateno Village, which is accessible very early in the game, and I upgraded that armor all the way through until the end of the game. If gear you get 5 hours into the game is still viable 50 hours into the game, that is indicative of a broken gear system. Nintendo could have easily fixed this by giving Link a static, upgradable defense statistic and saving perks for armor sets. This would separate the player's decision-making process when choosing armor and allow players to switch between them without sacrificing defense, which is far and away more useful than any half-baked perk could ever be. But this is just the beginning of the issues with Breath of the Wild's gear, because there are some armor sets that are better than others. For example, the Barbarian armor set gives Link a passive attack boost, and the Ancient armor set allows Link to deal bonus damage to Guardian enemies, which is extremely helpful in Hyrule Castle. These armor sets are considered to be the best in the game, but the effort required to get them is not commensurate with their utility in the slightest. The Barbarian armor set can be found in 3 chests scattered around the map, or more accurately, just one Google search. The Ancient armor can be purchased from a vendor in exchange for Ancient Cores, an item that can be obtained in chests around the map or by killing Guardian enemies. A small price to pay for one of the best armor sets in the game, to be sure. Just as there are armor sets that are easy to get, there are also bad armor sets that are really hard to get, namely the Wild set. You'd think that an armor set that bears the game's title would be powerful, but once again, that's not the case. Players can obtain the Armor of the Wild by completing all 120 main game shrines, a tall task to say the least. Finding every single shrine in the game without the help of the internet took me nearly 80 hours, and it required me to explore the map in its entirety, not to mention solving about 60 puzzles and doing 30 redundant tests of strength. And what was my reward? The Armor of the Wild, which gives Link a slight boost to his Master Sword beam. That is a comically useless perk. For this perk to be in effect, you need to equip the Master Sword, which gets outdamaged by every late-game weapon, and you also need to be at full health. This extremely situational boost would be justified if it made the beam do massive damage, but in reality it actually takes the beam's damage from 20 to a still meager 25, and that's when the Master Sword is powered up by Ganon's Dark Aura. Normally, it takes the beam's damage from 10 to 15, which is hardly enough damage to kill low-level enemies. The only saving grace of the Armor of the Wild is that it mirrors Link's classic green outfit from previous titles, which is a nice nod to the roots of the series. Still, most players want to prioritize functionality over aesthetics, making the Armor of the Wild a gross waste of time for anyone trying to get it. With armor out of the way, let's talk about weapons, which are arguably a bigger disaster. First off, Breath of the Wild's weapons have a superfluous and confusing element system, and I realize at this point it seems like nitpicking. I'm going back and reading through my script here, and it really seems like a minor thing, but it bugs me because it really makes no sense. Fire weapons beat ice enemies, and ice weapons beat fire enemies, and that makes sense. But there's also electric weapons, which don't beat either one, but they electrocute enemies in water. The fact that there's no counter to electric weapons makes fighting against them frustrating. It also negates the player's need for using electric gear. Ice weapons are only useful because they beat fire enemies and vice versa. So why add electric? If you're going to add electric, why not give it a counterpart so at least there's a rock, paper, scissors dynamic? Because the current dynamic is rock, paper, scissors, except rock beats paper, paper beats rock, and scissors sort of beats both but isn't really participating. I don't think rock, paper, scissors would have caught on if it worked that way, but that's just me. The problem with Breath of the Wild's elemental system, though, pales in comparison to the real problem, the durability system. One of the inherent pleasures of playing a game with a gear system is getting to choose the gear you prefer. Take Dark Souls, for example. I like using smaller and more agile daggers, but others prefer greatswords, and yet everyone can make it through the game at a similar pace by playing their own way. In Breath of the Wild, the game's design encourages the player to find weapons they like and stow them away forever for fear of them breaking. In the Zelda universe, apparently swords are made of styrofoam because they break constantly. Even higher level swords in the game break after killing 5 to 10 enemies, whereas lower level weapons may break after 5 to 10 swings. This broken, pun intended, system motivates the player to hang on to good weapons and save them just for encounters with stronger enemies. I spent the majority of my playthrough using lower level weaponry for common enemies and building an ever-growing collection of good weapons in my backpack. Needless to say, I was extremely prepared for Hyrule Castle, but at the cost of using bad weaponry for the rest of the game. Why create a system where the game's best loot is only useful to the player for a few minutes of gameplay at a time? The argument I hear most is that the durability system motivates players to try different weapons, and I agree, sort of, but it fails to address the fact that the durability system makes the game less fun. At the end of the day, I would rather find a piece of awesome gear and enjoy using it rather than cycling through tons of weapons just to get by. Having to bring up a menu during a fight several times because I need a new weapon also makes the flow of combat choppy and unsatisfying. In addition, there are ways to get players to try new gear without having weapons break every few minutes. One easy way would have been to make specific side quests give unique weapons as a reward. Currently, Breath of the Wild side quests are a needless chore designed for players who are patient enough to get 100% completion. Not only do side quests give no unique rewards, they barely give any reward at all. Even side quests that take a significant amount of time reward something as useless as a red rupee, which is the Breath of the Wild equivalent of a crisp $5 bill. I've been told that side quests are rewarding because they're inherently fun to complete, but in my experience they usually involve doing boring chores for townsfolk, like finding chickens in a pumpkin patch or something. Making side quests reward Link with unique weaponry would make them a must-play part of the game. Moreover, knowing that there's a worthwhile reward at the end of a given quest would make completing it more bearable, no matter how tedious. Another way to motivate players to experiment with gear is to make enemies significantly harder in later areas. This could be hard to execute in an open-world space like Breath of the Wild, but it would help the game in a variety of ways. If there were areas in Hyrule that were simply too difficult for an inexperienced player, it would add to the sense of adventure and improvement that the game already has. If my sword does 14 damage and it has little effect on the enemies I'm fighting, I would be motivated to explore other areas and then find something better so I can succeed. And it doesn't matter what kind of weapon I find. If I were to find a spear that did 20 damage instead of a sword that did 14, I would be motivated to use it. The difficulty of a given area can be all of the motivation the player needs to try new weapons, but instead the design team took another shortcut by introducing the frustratingly overstated durability system. When a weapon's shelf life is so low, it totally ruins the experience of finding a new piece of gear. What good is a 50 damage club when I know it's going to break 20 swings later? The easiest fix would have been to scrap the durability system entirely and make good weapons harder to find. This is the system most conventional gear-based games use, and I see no reason to change it. Give common enemies equally common gear, and save the great gear for boss drops and difficult quests. This would also add a sense of continuity to the player's progression. Their inventory would serve as a time capsule where the player could remember what specific in-game experience led to each piece of gear. Or, if you really think the durability system was a great addition, at least add a mechanic where players can trade materials for repaired gear. The odd thing is, Breath of the Wild tried both of these things in specific cases. After beating the first Divine Beast, you are rewarded with the Light Scale Trident as a gift from the Zora, the race of people you've just saved. This adds a huge sense of legitimacy to receiving the Trident. There's a definitive moment and reason for you getting the weapon, and using it feels awesome. And if the Trident breaks, which it most certainly will, there's a merchant in the Zora's area who will fix it for you in exchange for materials. This system could be applied across the entire game, with less materials required to repair lower-level gear. That way, a player would still need to use all of the weapons at their disposal, while also having more of a reason to return to towns and villages for repair. Additionally, making players wait longer for better weapons would add some much-needed difficulty to the game, but I'll address that in a moment. The obvious loophole in the durability system is the Master Sword. In past Zelda games, the Master Sword was clearly the best weapon in the game. Getting it meant that the search for weapons was over. You, the player, had found the most legendary weapon of all time, and it was powerful enough to match its mythos. In Breath of the Wild, however, the Master Sword is only useful because it can't break. In terms of strength, the sword does an unimpressive 30 damage. For reference, by the time I was able to even get to the Master Sword, most of my weapons were in the 40 to 60 damage range. However, in the presence of Ganon's energy, the sword will charge up and do a slightly more impressive 60 damage. The caveat here is that the boost rarely applies in the overworld, and it's mostly useful in Hyrule Castle, at which point most of my weapons were in the 60 to 100 damage range anyway. The Master Sword is truly only useful in the event that the player is fighting low-level enemies and doesn't want any of their good gear to break. This totally flies in the face of what the Master Sword is all about, and its poor implementation in Breath of the Wild for the sake of a stupid durability system is one of the biggest black marks on the game as a whole. When I first started my playthrough of Breath of the Wild, I thought Nintendo had absolutely nailed the difficulty. Every time I died, I thought it was my fault for not being stealthy enough or not being accurate enough with my limited supply of arrows. Every enemy camp I encountered required legitimate planning to beat. Higher level enemies killed me in 1 or 2 hits, motivating me to master the game's dodging and combat mechanics. However, as I started accumulating Sheikah abilities, cooking ingredients, and weapons, dying became less and less of a possibility. To be clear, I understand that Nintendo games cater to a wider audience than niche titles like Dark Souls, but if a game's challenge vanishes completely, then design tweaks are necessary. If you died frequently in Breath of the Wild after unlocking all of Link's abilities, then you simply weren't taking advantage of the vast array of tools the game gives you that make dying nearly impossible. For starters, you can pause the game at any point to replenish your health with food. Several recipes in the game heal most, all, or more than all of Link's health, and you can carry a whopping 60 food items, meaning that you have practically infinite healing capabilities. Also, should Link somehow die, he will be instantly resurrected by Mipha's Grace, an ability that can be obtained early in the game that allows Link to revive himself to more than full strength upon death. But the ability is on a 24-minute cooldown, so if the player dies twice within that time frame, Link won't self-revive. Unless, of course, they have any fairies in their inventory, which are a rare-ish item that also revives Link upon death. If that wasn't enough, Link also gets a variety of damage upgrades that motivate the player to shy away from the game's simple but rewarding combat system. The Daruk's Protection ability automatically blocks and parries 3 enemy attacks before a short cooldown, totally negating the need for the player to parry or dodge consistently. Urbosa's Fury deals massive damage in a large area around Link, decimating crowds of enemies instantly. Link also has the ability to freeze enemies in time, slow down time in the air, throw bombs, and do a variety of other things that make him an absolute juggernaut by the time the game is over. The only enemies that pose a threat later in the game are Lynels and the Guardians in Hyrule Castle, and neither of them are hard for the right reasons. Lynels are only difficult because of their massive damage output and enormous health bars, and since Link can heal to his heart's content, pun also intended, the fight ends up being a drawn-out and repetitive grind rather than a challenging battle. As Egoraptor so brilliantly pointed out, poorly designed enemies tend to replace difficulty with time because things that take a long time feel difficult when in reality they aren't. Guardians, on the other hand, are only difficult in Hyrule Castle because there's so many of them. Plus, if you hoard ancient weapons because you don't want them to break, like I did, then that challenge dissipates anyway. This total lack of difficulty takes the game's stakes away. When Link becomes an invincible destroyer of worlds with infinite healing and insane damage output, clearing camps of enemies stops feeling like an adventure and it starts feeling like a chore. When the fear of death is taken away from the player, there's never a reason for them to lean forward in their seat or for their heart rate to increase. The game world becomes less alive without the fear of something that could defeat Link easily. Another thing I hear is that Breath of the Wild is like a 3D version of the very first Zelda, but this is one area where they are nothing alike. In the original Zelda, the player was always in fear of discovering something that they just couldn't handle. It made exploring scary, but most of all, it made exploring fun. I know that DLC packs have given players options like Master Mode to increase difficulty, but the vanilla game's total lack of challenge is impossible for me to ignore. I'm not saying that Link shouldn't get stronger as the game goes on. I think character improvement is necessary for any adventure game, but the key factor is when that improvement happens and to what degree. The ideal scenario, in my eyes, is that the player and their character get steadily stronger throughout the game, but the enemies they face are always slightly ahead. That way, the player would have more tools at their disposal while overcoming obstacles, but they would also need to master those tools in order to progress. Then, when the player beats the main story and transitions to the endgame, they should be able to get as strong as they want to. Pokemon games are a perfect example of this kind of design. After beating the Elite Four, the game's final challenge, the player is still free to explore the world and collect Pokemon as long as they want. Players can build an entire team of legendaries and absolutely steamroll every trainer in their way, but because of the progression's pacing, it feels earned. The player has succeeded in beating all of the main game challenges, so becoming an unstoppable super trainer doesn't take away from the experience in any way. Being obscenely strong lets the player collect all of the Pokemon they want without the normal stress of managing a less powerful team. It makes catching them all a rewarding and fun experience. In Breath of the Wild, the player becomes much too powerful too early in the game. The Divine Beast abilities are so strong it would be like if you got a legendary after every gym leader. The core of these progression issues come from one thing: Breath of the Wild has no endgame. Breath of the Wild is guilty of one of my biggest game design pet peeves: not letting the player continue after the final boss has been defeated. After defeating Ganon in all of his forms, the game fades to black, and instead of a cutscene or resolution of some kind, the player is teleported outside Ganon's chambers as if the fight never happened. This violates even the most basic rules of storytelling. Killing Ganon is obviously the climactic moment of the story, so having no content beyond that left me feeling shortchanged. It would be like if the credits rolled in a movie the moment after the villain was killed. I wanted to see Hyrule Castle free of Ganon's wrath, and I wanted to see Zelda finally return home after 100 years of conflict. I even thought the castle would become a hub world like Kakariko Village, where I could enjoy a peaceful Hyrule. Who knows, maybe King Rome's ghost would return and congratulate us on our victory, give us a little pat on the back. But none of that happened. Not only does this design choice leave the story arc of the game in an awkward spot, it also impacts the gameplay in a negative way. If the player was free to explore Hyrule after defeating Ganon, Breath of the Wild players could enjoy a legitimate endgame, a structure that would allow the game to stop deliberately taking cool things away from the player for the sake of balance. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, here's some examples. On one fictional night in Hyrule, I noticed a mountain in the distance with a glowing blue beam coming out of the top. It was a good distance away, so I decided to wait until morning and check it out. I rode my horse to the mountain where the blue light had been, and what I found at the top was a calm pond covered in pink leaves. I stayed at night because that's when I had seen the beam. I heard strange noises and turned around to see a spirit in front of me with the head of an owl and the body of a horse. After slowly approaching, I tamed the spirit and began riding it. I was thrilled. Not only was there no shrine at the top of the mountain, but there was a ghost horse with infinite stamina and amazing speed. Finally, Breath of the Wild rewarded me for exploring with something unexpected and useful. Naturally, I took my horse to the nearest stables as I thought of what I might name him. Phantom? Greg? As I approached the stable keeper, he cowered in fear and told me he couldn't board a monster. After doing some research online, it appeared there was no way to put the spirit in the stables. This meant that if I used fast travel at any point, Greg would be left behind at my previous location, rendering him useless for the most part. I was furious. Why would you do this, Nintendo? Why add an awesome ghost horse that I had to explore to find, and then make it totally obsolete under the game's framework? The most logical explanation is that a horse that powerful would make traveling around the map too easy, a balancing issue, essentially. If the Ghost Owl horse was only available after defeating Ganon in the endgame, then having a fast, efficient, and fun way to get around Hyrule wouldn't be an issue. And then they'd added a motorcycle anyway, so why not let you board the Ghost Horse if you're going to have a motorcycle, which is essentially the same thing? The other example of Breath of the Wild's design intentionally robbing the player of cool things happens during the final fight with Ganon when he's in classic pig form. Zelda gives Link the Bow of Light just for the final battle. The bow is incredibly powerful, has nearly infinite range, and has infinite ammo. It looks stunning too, truly the ultimate weapon for a hero like Link. However, as soon as Link defeats Ganon and the game resets, the bow is gone. If Breath of the Wild had a legitimate endgame, using the Bow of Light in the overworld would easily have been the highlight of my playthrough, no questions asked. If sniping enemies from the tops of mountains with a bow from the gods doesn't sound fun to you, then I don't know what possibly could. But again, the choice to have the game reset after the Ganon fight limits the game's design possibilities in an effort to balance an already unbalanced game. With that being said, I only have this complaint because the Bow of Light was so cool in the first place. Riding on horseback and shooting arrows of sunlight into Dark Beast Ganon's gross piggly head was an epic conclusion to Breath of the Wild's story, endgame or not. The entire Calamity Ganon fight was fun and well designed, but unfortunately I can't say the same for the rest of the game's bosses. Some of the most memorable moments in previous Zelda games, and in video games in general, have come in the form of boss battles, from Bowser to Dr. Wily to King K. Rool. There's nothing quite like going up against a difficult boss and succeeding through the use of precise gameplay and strategy, yet Breath of the Wild misses the mark in this area as well, which is surprising, since Nintendo has historically been one of the best developers in the business in terms of crafting fantastic bosses. Sure, they may be formulaic, you hit their weak spot 3 times and you win, but that never hampered the experience for me until now. Before I discuss the 4 main bosses before Ganon and Breath of the Wild, I need to address the dungeons they're housed in, the Divine Beasts. Zelda games have come under scrutiny in the past for making dungeons too predictable, and for good reason. Players got tired of the classic sequence of entering a dungeon, encountering a problem, finding an item that fixes said problem, and then defeating the boss. So when I heard that Breath of the Wild's dungeons broke the Zelda formula once again, I thought that meant the dungeons were designed more creatively, allowing the player to use more than just one clear-cut item to get through the slew of enemies and rooms. The last thing I expected to find was giant, empty puzzle rooms, but here we are. The more I reflect on why I dislike the Divine Beasts, the more I realize the hated Zelda formula got so much right. I mean, we're talking about one of the most successful and beloved series in the history of gaming. I don't think players' complaints came from the fact that there were enemies and items and treasure chests, but rather from the implementation of those things. But instead of changing the existing conventions of dungeons slightly to fit Breath of the Wild's more unstructured gameplay, Nintendo threw traditional dungeons out of the window and gave us 100-foot-tall puzzle shrines shaped like animals. And worse yet, the puzzles were more frustrating than they were fun. When I encountered my first Divine Beast, I was once again overcome with excitement. Divine Beasts were supposed to be a pivotal moment in Link's journey to reassemble the Dream Team and defeat Calamity Ganon, and it certainly appears as such at first. I had to shoot and fight my way to the beast itself while riding on the back of the Prince of the Zoras, a sequence that demanded several accurate bow shots in a row, all with lightning roaring in the background. I finally mounted the beast and drew my favorite claymore in preparation for battle. Instead, I was faced with globs of goo and a series of frustrating puzzles. Ideally, a puzzle gives the person trying to solve it all of the necessary information, and then it's up to that person to assemble that information in the correct way. Further, solving the puzzle should be rewarding. To further quote Egoraptor, solving puzzles should be an aha, not an ah come on moment. Yet, Breath of the Wild's Divine Beasts are filled with the latter. Firstly, the majority of the Divine Beast puzzles can be solved by cycling Sheikah abilities until something works. Secondly, the design choice to have puzzles on such a massive scale demands that the player spend an absurd amount of time backtracking. On several occasions, the player must interact with something on one side of the beast that changes something on the other. So, if the player wants to actually put thought into the puzzle rather than button mashing, they would have to spend at least a minute running through hallways and rooms to check their progress. About halfway through the first Divine Beast puzzle, I was faced with an obstacle I couldn't get past. A waterfall was coming from the ceiling above, and I needed to somehow redirect the water to spin a water wheel in another room. I tried everything, but no matter how many slate abilities I tried or how many arrows I shot into the stream, nothing happened. After almost half an hour of running around and trying everything I could, I finally paused the game in defeat to look the answer up online, which is probably my least favorite thing to do when I play a game. When I paused the game, it revealed a map of the Divine Beast, complete with a button that changed the angle of the waterfall. This was the epitome of an ah come on moment. I consider my pause menu to be outside of the game world, so being forced to pause over and over to solve the puzzle totally ruined my sense of immersion. I no longer felt like an adventurer defeating the forces of evil, but rather a guy on his couch navigating a menu with a Switch controller. This feature would be almost excusable if the game made any effort to tell you that you can manipulate the puzzles from within the pause menu, but it doesn't really. What's even more baffling about the Divine Beasts is the fact that the design team chose to make them puzzles in the first place. As I mentioned before, almost every avenue for exploration in the overworld leads to a shrine, so why make the Divine Beasts puzzles? It's not like entering a giant room and solving a puzzle is a fresh experience for the player, especially by the time they've reached multiple Divine Beasts. While I would have been totally satisfied with a more traditional dungeon system, I would have even settled for an epic boss fight with no puzzle element attached at all. However, that would only work if the bosses were unique or fun to fight. The bosses in Breath of the Wild are truly one of the biggest missed opportunities I have ever seen in a video game, let alone one with such acclaim. First off, the bosses in each Divine Beast look practically identical, which is odd considering Breath of the Wild's visuals have great variety in nearly every other aspect of gameplay. But no, all 4 of the main bosses in Breath of the Wild are goopy robot Ganon monsters with glowing eyeballs. And if people are going to criticize past Zelda dungeons for being too predictable, then Breath of the Wild deserves the same scrutiny. Egoraptor jokes about how every Zelda boss is just shooting a big glowing eye with an arrow, yet he praised Breath of the Wild wholeheartedly. Every single Divine Beast boss does in fact have a glowing eyeball, and instead of using a unique item, you just use another Sheikah Slate ability to defeat them. So how exactly has Breath of the Wild improved on Zelda bosses? To me, the bosses in past Zelda games were vastly superior. It's been years since I touched Twilight Princess, but I still vividly remember fighting Stalord the Twilight Fossil and Argarok the Twilight Dragon. Those bosses were memorable because they looked different, they were in different settings, and they were defeated in totally different ways. You know what I remember from Breath of the Wild's bosses? Fighting 4 equally annoying robot monsters while inside 4 bigger robot monsters. That's it. Is that a greatest game of all time experience? It certainly doesn't feel that way. Breath of the Wild's overworld bosses do a better job on the aesthetic front, but that's really it. Sure, a stone talus may look different than a Hinox, but they don't play differently. Both make you shoot their big, glaring weakness and then run in to deal as much damage as you can before they wake up. The settings of these mini-bosses also play no role in their gameplay, making these encounters feel soulless in general. Fighting a Hinox atop Mount Nairu will go the same way as fighting a Hinox all the way on the other side of the map. There is one mini-boss that does incorporate the setting into the fight though, the Molduga. It's worth mentioning this particular mini-boss because it's an example of how well all of the other bosses could have been designed. The fight is only accessible in the desert area of the game, so the encounter itself reflects that. The Molduga, which is a worm-like creature, burrows underground to ambush Link, dealing huge damage. You can either ride a sand seal to outrun the Molduga and wait for it to breach, or you can place a bomb behind you and detonate it as the Molduga approaches, which will stun it and let you deal damage. Already the player is having to think on a level far beyond shoot at their weakness with an arrow. And Breath of the Wild could have been filled with these thoughtful and engaging boss encounters. There could have been a forest monster who you defeat by chopping trees and pinning him to the ground, or a boss fight in the open ocean where you have to lure them to land to deal damage. But because of Breath of the Wild's copy and paste game design formula, we got 50 mediocre boss fights instead of 10 great ones. This isn't so much a critique as it is a reflection of what Breath of the Wild could have been. If you're a Breath of the Wild fan and you've made it this far into the video, I want to emphasize to you that I'm not tearing the game apart out of malice. I make these points and bring these design issues to light because people act like Breath of the Wild is or is one of the greatest games ever. While I obviously disagree, the tragedy of it all is I think it could have been the greatest game ever with just a few design changes. Nintendo gave Breath of the Wild players a gorgeous world to explore, and took the Zelda franchise in an ambitious new direction, which I applaud them for. But could you imagine if that gorgeous world was filled with equally vibrant experiences? What if you approached every new obstacle with no knowledge of what was to come? What if every boss looked and felt different? What if the game was actually challenging and made you feel like a legendary adventurer for succeeding? What if you could collect your favorite gear and know it was never going to break? What if side quests gave unique rewards? What if the Master Sword was the best sword in the game and getting it felt as good as it did in past Zeldas? The list goes on. I think ultimately the story of Breath of the Wild is a story of infectious enthusiasm coupled with people looking at the game for what it could be rather than what it is. The game world is so striking and so polished that few are willing to look under the hood and see what the raw mechanics of the game really are. And frankly, I was in the same boat until the end of my playthrough. Obviously, everything I've said here is just my opinion, and if you still love Breath of the Wild, that's fine. Still, I think there's value in looking at the game critically and examining how the game's moving parts contribute to the overall experience. This generation of gamers is willing to interact and voice opinions to developers in an unprecedented way, and the more that happens, the more likely we are to get a game that truly deserves the title of the greatest game of all time.